Hi everyone, welcome to Maple Sugaring Adirondack Style. We're just waiting for people to come on through and then we'll start the program. So just give us a couple of minutes. We're just waiting a few minutes to let people into the program. As I said, welcome to Maple Sugaring Adirondack Style. It's the first in a series of collaborative programs between Albany Public Library and the Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake, also known as ADKX. And I would like to give a heartfelt thanks to ADKX for partnering with us, especially to Cheryl Bronstein, Director of Interpretation, who really made this thing happen. And of course, thanks to all the ADKX staff that are involved with this program. So as I said, tonight's the first program. Coming up next week on the 31st, I just want to read you a little description of it. It's called Food, Glorious Food, Adirondack Style. Get a glimpse of the menus from Adirondack resort hotels and great camps during their heyday in the 1800s. How did the food served up to the wealthy differ from food and recipes popular among How did the food served up to the wealthy differ from food and recipes popular among average Adirondack residents? Bethany Nyborg will be our guide through that program. She's a former intern from ADKX, and she's also going to cook a dish from that time period to show the audience. And also coming up in April are a couple of programs aimed at children, and that the series is called Try This at Home. One is on butter making, and the other one is called the Balsamic Tradition, or the Balsam Tradition. And any of those programs I just mentioned, you can sign up for on the Adirondack Experience website or the Albany Public Library website. And I'll put in the chat box the titles of the programs and the dates, so it'll be easier to find them on our calendars of events. And back to tonight's program, Maple Sugaring. Our two speakers are Matt Thomas and Ivy Gocker. Matt, an independent maple syrup historian, is the author of A Sugar Bush Like None Other, Adirondack Maple Syrup and the Horseshoe Forestry Company. And that's the first one. And the other book is Maple King, The Making of a Maple Syrup Empire. If anyone's interested, the library has a copy of A Sugar Bush Like None Other that you can check out. And Ivy Gocker, who came up with the great idea of having this topic as a program. She's been library director of the Adirondack Experience since 2016. Prior to that, she worked for 9 years at Brooklyn Public Library in New York City, spending her last 6 in the library's local history and special collections department. And she has a master's degree in library science from Pratt Institute. So before I turn it over to Matt and Ivy, I just want to let you know that there'll be a question and answer session towards the end of the program. So if you have any questions for either of our speakers, just submit them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, just let us know in the chat box. And one thing I forgot to mention is that we are working on another program, of course, food, Adirondack style, but it's a collaboration between Paul Smith's College Culinary Arts Department, and they're going to prepare a menu worth of food. And if you stick around at the end of this program tonight, Cheryl Bronstein is going to tell you more about that. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt and Ivy. Thanks, folks. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much. I am going to share my screen here. Try to get that right. And let's see. How does that look? All right. I think that looks good. Is anyone, if anyone can't see it, let me know somehow. So tonight our conversation, our presentation is.
Sorry, Matt. Yeah, I don't think your screen is sharing.
Isn't it working? Okay, hold on. Let's try this again.
I thought it was just me, but now I'm seeing in the chat.
What am I doing? Oh, I hit. There we go.
All right. Yeah.
Boom. Wrong button. How's that? That should work. Thank you, Ivy. All right. So tonight, our conversation presentation is on maple sugaring Adirondack style. And what we're specifically going to focus on is kind of a historical presentation on a pretty interesting and important bit of maple sugaring history in the Adirondacks. And that's probably the most famous maple sugaring operation in the Adirondacks, and it was the Horseshoe Forestry Company maple sugar operation run by Abbot Augustus Lowe from 1898 to 1908, and he had a 45,000 acre estate, a great estate up in the Adirondacks. And so in the area, you can see Horseshoe Lake on the slide is, there's an arrow pointing to it just southwest of Tupper Lake. So it's kind of the northwest part of the Adirondack Park area up in far northern New York. And so specifically, this map shows Horseshoe Lake and some of the key features, some of which I'll talk about in Abbot Augustus Lowe's estate. So unlike a lot of the other great estates, which there were a number of at the same time in that part of the world, where the super rich were buying up lots of acreage and building retreats and great camps and essentially recreational private parks for themselves, Abbot Augustus Lowe, A.A. Lowe, had a little bit of a different perspective and plan. He was looking at how to use his big forested landscape a little more differently. And he built a number of important features on the landscape. He built dams for electrical power, two in particular on the Bog River, known as the Lower Dam and the Upper Dam. He built a number of sawmills for making lumber, primarily for his own use in building more buildings and other things for his camp and his industrial landscape. He had also, in spite of me talking about the industrial side of it, he and his family did have their own private retreat, which they built. Although compared to some, it was much more primitive or a little less elegant, but still pretty nice, pretty sophisticated. They did still dress for dinner and had plenty of servants and help like all the other rich, great camps. But the big thing that he did in his industrial landscape at the Horseshoe area is focus on making maple syrup and maple sugar. And that's where this story is most important and what we're going to talk about tonight. So one big part of that, well, you'll see in this slide a network of railroads. This was a time when railroading was a great way to get around. There weren't that many roads. There were no automobiles yet. This was the turn of the last century. And so railroads are a key feature, and I'll come back to that. But you can see a series of them kind of stretching out through the forest here. And you'll see, like on the labeling, Maple Valley RR, that's Maple Valley Railroad. Wake Robin RR, that's a Wake Robin Railroad. So we'll come back to those. But in building this maple sugaring landscape, he did it like nobody had ever done before. It's quite phenomenal. In fact, at that time in our history of New York and history of maple sugaring, he didn't just build sugar houses. As you can see in this picture through the woods, he built essentially syrup plants. These were massive, monumental things. And nobody had ever done anything even close to that. No scale even came close to that. And what's really great about understanding the whole Horseshoe Forestry Company story and what happened out at Horseshoe is an incredible series of photographs, of which this is one. And they were black and white photos, but they were hand colored by the photographer George Baldwin from Saranac Lake, who was hired by Abbott Augustus Lowe to take a whole grouping of them, and they were put into an album. And he hand colored them, some more so than others, which is just phenomenal because they're incredibly detailed, very, very great photographs. And there's two collections of these albums. One is in the Adirondack Experience collections, which is the ones you're seeing in this presentation. And then there was another set that were put in the Library of Congress for copyright. So Abbott Augustus Lowe did things in a very formal ways, which we'll talk about more as we go along. But they're just incredible photos. And so you're going to see them again and again. And I just want to emphasize it's such a great collection of them in the Adirondack Experience collection. So he had this maple operation. He started in 1897, really making maple syrup, not on a super big scale, but it was still larger than anybody almost around at that time. He was right out of the door. He was tapping 5,000 to 10,000 trees. He had a plan very early on that he was going to be fairly large, but it grew exponentially from there. And just as a kind of comparison, sugaring operations in other parts of New England and New York at that time, when they were considered large, that was 1,000 to 2,000 tap operations. Sometimes there was a few that got up to 10,000, and they were considered extremely big. Well, by 1901, Abbott Augustus Lowe's Horseshoe Forestry was up to 50,000 taps, which just is an almost unimaginable number at that time. And he boiled the syrup, which was a massive amount of syrup, in these gigantic 6-foot wide, 18-foot long evaporators. So if you look at this sugar house, you can see a series of smokestacks. You can't see all of them that clearly, but if you were able to zoom in, you could tell that there's 5 of these in a row, giant evaporators, where the syrup was processed and turned into, or the sap was processed and turned into maple syrup. And he had 4 of these plants in different parts of his maple forest. So imagine there was about 19 evaporators this big working to boil all that sap from 50,000 taps. So how did he move all that sap? Well, he built his own private railroad, and he built 3 different branches of his own private railroad with his own private engines. And he would often, that wasn't the only way, but it was the primary way he moved sap, was on these big tanks on flatbeds that were pulled by the railroad. And it was just an incredible way and amount of moving sap. But what's important to remember is he still did all the tapping with metal spiles of the era and metal pails and sap covers. And every one of those trees from 50,000 taps still had to be hand gathered by individuals every day. And they would then either carry it to horse-drawn tanks and bring them to the railroad, or bring them directly to the syrup plants, Or he had another ingenious thing, which he did, which is he installed, and he's not the first one to do this. Others had done it, but he did it on a scale that was just, again, beyond anyone before. He built his own pipelines where you would carry the pails from the trees to these funnels on the pipelines, and they would run it downhill to tanks by the railroad and then be railroaded into the syrup plants. Pretty efficient, pretty sophisticated. But again, he was a man, he was an extremely wealthy man. He would be a billionaire by today's standards, from Brooklyn. And he had the means to do it. And he was one who seldom ever cut corners on cost. If he wanted something, he did it. He was essentially like a gentleman farmer. He was a gentleman sugar maker. He didn't do this to get any richer. He did it because it was something he really loved and wanted to do, and wanted to try to do better and in new ways. He had a massive workforce, as you might imagine, as well. There was a lot of work to be done to haul this much sap and move, this much syrup through his organization. So we have, from research, shown, looked at some of the census data, and we have records of some of his payment records for his crews and things. And there would be about 150 during the main part of the year. He had about 100 people employed at Horseshoe. During the sugaring season, he would have 150 to 200 men gathering sap, running the horse teams, making syrup in his 4 giant plants, and working day and night in the sugaring season. So to house all them, he had there's a bit at the Horseshoe settlement where he also happened to build the railroad station. So I should go back, or I should emphasize that one of the reasons he chose this location to purchase all this land and expand it into his industrial landscape is that the New York Central Railroad ran right through here, and the village of Horseshoe and the station of Horseshoe was right in the center of everything, and that was a perfect staging area for him to expand his operations. So in the Horseshoe settlement, he had a couple of big boarding houses and a farm, and he had dairy animals and horses and pigs and chickens and gardens and everything to feed his massive crew. So it was essentially his own private village of that. He owned everything. He employed everyone there, with the exception of the station manager, superintendent for the railroad. But he electrified everything. Another fascinating aspect of his operation was, in the turn of the last century, at first he had a whole series of dynamos, of electrical generators. So everything was electrified. It had lights. And then he built the first dam in 1903 and another dam in 1907, which were hydroelectric dams. But even before that, from 1897, from the very beginning, he had electrical lights. In fact, he had electrical lights out at Horseshoe before they had electricity in Tupper Lake, which is pretty interesting to think about. This is another example of one of his other so there were 4. This is another one, and this is called the Wake Robin Sugar House or syrup plant. And this one was located right on the southwest shore of Horseshoe Lake. There are remains of it out there if you know where to find them. And as part of the research I did for the book that was mentioned at the beginning, myself and my research colleague, Mary Kunzler-Larman, have been out on the ground locating the remains of where these places were. And we found almost every single one of the sugar plants. There's one that we have an idea is the right spot, but we couldn't quite verify it the way we could the other 3. But this one is called the Wake Robin one, and you can just see how it sprawls. It has the big evaporator smokestacks, and it just moves out, along the shoreline. And right now, if you were to stand in the middle of the road on Highway 421 along the South Shore at an area that's kind of a gravel pit at the east end and stare towards the lake, you'd be looking at what used to be this sugar plant, syrup plant. This is another one. This was labeled as the Maple Valley syrup plant or sugar house. And there's two Maple Valley ones. There's the well-known one, which I showed a picture of at the very beginning, but there's also this one, which is the one that's kind of less well-known. But I do believe we found the right location. We just haven't found any remains to support the location on the ground. But from other photos of it that I'm not showing every photo tonight, we have a pretty good idea of where that one was. But again, just massive buildings with, you can see the pipelines stretching up, elevated through the trees, bringing that sap right into the sugar house. And this is another really interesting one that is known as the Grass River Sugar House or syrup plant. And we knew of a small syrup plant from photos in this area, but we didn't know exactly where those were located. But we never knew that there was a large one. We always, from past research, we always thought there was just a small one at that location and references to it. But then a few years ago, another historian named Susan Smaby from Potsdam found a really interesting photograph of this that was labeled. And we put two and two together from some research, looking at other photos really closely, but also getting out on the ground and re-examining locations and lining things back up to discover where exactly this is. And what's really interesting is that this is a little tiny, if you look at this photo, it's just a little tiny glass hand-colored slide from a magic lantern slide, as they call them. And I'm just dumbfounded by the quality and the resolution and what you can learn from just a little tiny slide. But this showed another really big one on this location. And we, as I said, we went out on the ground and we're able to line up the exact same spot from a number of different photos. We can see this same shape on the ground. And if you're really interested in that kind of stuff, the archaeology of this story, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book we mentioned, because there's maps and details and discussions and presentations of the things we found on the ground, and even more about how exactly we found these places and how they all tie together. So those are the main big syrup plants that he used to make this massive amount of syrup. But what else? What did he do with it? Well, he sold it, obviously. But what's a little bit different about A.A. Lowe is, as I said earlier, he was a man of great means. So he had the ability to do things that others didn't necessarily do. So he didn't just sell his sugar and syrup locally, or even just sell it in New York City, where he had great connections, especially in Brooklyn. His brother, for example, was the mayor of Brooklyn, and then the mayor of the first combined city of New York, Seth Lowe, famous name. So this guy was connected. Well, he advertised, so Abbot Augustus Lowe wanted to sell it even more broadly. He advertised in national magazines. Nobody ever advertised maple sugar or maple syrup products in national magazines at that point. You would see blended syrups like Log Cabin or some others that were big enough companies to do that, but there were no maple sugar or syrup companies that could afford to do that or even made that much product to do it. Well, he did. So he had these full-page ads in The Nation and Harper's and magazines like that, telling people of his great products, and they even illustrated the little glass jars and bottles in the bottom, which we'll come back to with his products. And one thing about Lowe and his horseshoe products is that he did things in a very formal way. And so one of the interesting things is he also did a lot of patenting and branding and stuff. And so he didn't just accept things as what was a simple way to do things. If he had a jar to pack his maple sugar in, well, he needed to have a jar that was embossed with his logo. And if he was going to have a maple syrup sap collection can like this, well, maybe he could improve on it. And if he was going to improve on it, well, could he sell it? So he did do a lot of inventive things, which is one of the things that people love to talk about with him, is that he was an inventor, and he had hundreds and hundreds of patents, and people like to tell the story that he had the second most patents behind Thomas Edison, which isn't exactly true. It's a great story, but research has shown that while he was a prolific patent earning individual, he did not have the second most patents to Edison. There were literally a dozen to a couple dozen people well ahead of him in that. But that really doesn't matter in the sense that he was a prolific guy who put his money to helping research, develop patents, and develop ideas to things. And he had his own ideas as well. And he put them to use, including in the sugar bush. So here's an example of a sap pail, which he didn't design this sap pail, but he designed the cover of this sap pail, and in conjunction with the G.H. Grimm Company out of Rutland, Vermont, which made the most maple sugaring equipment at that time. They specifically manufactured these and sold these as the horseshoe sap pail cover. But true to form, A.A. Lowe had to get his logo, his HSF Company, Horseshoe Forestry Company logo on there. And what's neat about them is there was a couple different designs, and he would paint one side yellow and one side red. And so you could flip them over and you would know as you went through the sugar bush collecting sap that if one was red, that pail had already been collected, and you could see from a distance that that tree had been gathered by one of your colleagues, and you didn't need to go hit it. So it's pretty cool, and we'll see some of that again here in a little bit. But as I said, he was a big guy for patenting things, and one really interesting thing is this is a picture of a prototype of a steam evaporator that he and two of his worker engineers that worked for him developed and patented and tested it, but never actually put it into commercial production, and they never actually put it into, I guess you could say, significant use within the Horseshoe Forestry Company. It's been written a few times before that all of his evaporators were steam powered, which is not true. That he invented this steam power prototype and patented two different variations on it, but all of the evaporators that were at the Horseshoe Forestry Company syrup plants that I showed the photos of were wood fired. All 19 of the large ones, they were not steam powered, but he was ahead of his time in trying steam heat as a more efficient way, especially when you're working on a scale like he did, where you could have gigantic evaporators fueled by boilers that were running steam pipes through them to boil very efficiently. And this is a really neat photo because it shows the inside of another building that's no longer there. Would have been up on the second floor, as we've kind of figured out from the various angles of the photos and the roof line and all the other aspects. And there's another photo of this particular steam evaporator with the two men who invented it standing next to it. It's just not as good a quality, so I didn't show it here. So I mentioned earlier we're gonna come to this. I'm gonna hold on this. Actually, hold on 1 second. So what's really interesting is that this whole great operation, it only lasted about 10 years. So in 1897, he really got started. By 1901, he was pretty much up to full speed with all the syrup plants built and 50,000 taps being run each season. And 10 years later, 1908 was the last season it ran. Unfortunately, in the fall of 1908, there were horrible wildfires that swept through the Adirondacks, and most of the major sugar bush maple stands of the Horseshoe Forestry Company of Lowe's estate were destroyed or seriously scorched by these wildfires, and it just wiped out his sugaring operation. He didn't lose the syrup buildings and the plants, and didn't necessarily have his railroads seriously destroyed. He protected them. He often used metal roofs and metal sided buildings and concrete, which was on, again, ahead of his time for that, and not necessarily even with the expectation that there was going to be a massive wildfire, but the trees were wiped out and they were not going to come back anytime soon. And so he never made syrup again after the 1908 season. And he started to sell off the property and divest the equipment. And unfortunately, a few years later in 1912, he died from bladder cancer, and his family then progressively sold off the rest of the estate in large chunks to private landowners, and who turned it into mostly recreational properties of their own. And then further on into time, which that's all a whole nother chapter in the whole story of Horseshoe, but then further on in time, he the estate essentially started to come back into state ownership. And today, the majority of it, not all of it, but the majority of it is now part of the Adirondack Park Preserve, and people enjoy the recreational benefits of that, and can. But the neat thing is that the story is still out there on the ground, and you can get out on the ground and poke around and see some of the things that were created by Lowe on that landscape. The roads that are there were mostly where the railroad grades used to be. Some of the openings and places where there might be campsites were areas where he had built structures, maybe sugar houses, or had the settlement at the Horseshoe Station, things like that. So, and again, if you're really interested in that, you can definitely learn a lot more from the book I wrote, and even use that as a little bit of a guide to exploring that for yourself out there in the woods. So we have also some really cool things we want to share.
Matt, really quick before we go into any of the artifacts, there was
Yes.
a question about that last image that you showed.
You bet. This one?
There's an item in the back corner behind the evaporators.
Yeah, what is that?
That is.
I'm not exactly sure. I think it has something to do, I think, and I'm not an expert. Well, there's a saw. There's a saw closer in the background, but I think they're asking about the thing that sort of looks like a weird gas pump or something. I think it's something related to the steam boiler and controlling the steam operation with the boiler. This is on the second floor in this building, and the boiler, I believe, was on the first floor. But I am not sure. I'm not an expert enough to know what that is. If someone thinks they know, by all means, send us a note. So, like you can see in this photo, just analyzing photos, you gotta love this. I mean, you see the light bulbs hanging up there. I mean, there's just all kinds of really cool stuff when you really dig deep. And some of these photos are amazing resolution, and you can sometimes get really good close-ups on things if you have the time and the interest. So, but let's see. So I gotta stop my screen share. If I can do this right. Stop share. Okay, so I'm gonna pass it to Ivy. She's got some great stuff to show us. All right, take it away, Ivy.
All right, thanks, Matt. And I wanted to mention, well, thank you for all of your incredible research. It was funny for me looking back at your book, because I remember when you were researching the book here at the museum, and it was shortly after I had started working here, and I feel like at the time I didn't know how to find anything here, so I appreciate the patience that you had for me then when I was a greenhorn at this job. And yeah, it's amazing too, just the research you were doing on the ground, of course, which is so important in placing these buildings, because I can attest, to the layperson's eye, there's not much left there that you can see. I was just out there last weekend with my family, and I couldn't see any of these buildings. So I'm impressed that you and Mary were able to sort of figure out where things were. But also just I wanted to just make a comment about how so much more is being put up online now that makes this kind of research possible also, like all of the old advertisements that you found, and all of these things from newspapers and different resources, and even our photographs that we've digitized. The kind of research you can do now compared to what you would have been able to do 10 or 15 years ago, I imagine has to kind of change the whole outlook of doing this
It's
kind of
phenomenal. Yeah. I mean, my research partner and I, we're real sticklers about trying to find as many lines of evidence as we can and question previous work, which there's been a lot of great work. And unfortunately, sometimes people do great work and they don't cite where they get great information. So but we have even more tools, as you say. So we try not to like be too negative about work that was done before, but to take advantage of it, it's phenomenal how much is out there, and then it just mushrooms. You get new ideas and new leads, and it just keeps. I mean, I one thing I encourage people to do is, if you're really research minded, don't take any of this for the gospel truth. Go do your own research, because there's always more research to do. There's always new little avenues to go down and new little topics and stories to investigate, and it'll never be done. So by all means, go for it. But it's fun to go out in the woods too, and like you say, go see what it looks like now.
Yeah.
I mean, not right now. There's a little bit of snow and mud right now, but in a month it'll be great, and right before the bugs come.
Yeah. So yeah, here at the museum, we have a lot of different collections that touch on A.A. Lowe and his whole operation out at Horseshoe. And so I just pulled a few different things from storage that seem to best illustrate some of the topics that Matt's talking about tonight. And so I'll start. One thing you didn't really touch on, and I'd be curious to have you speak more to this, because I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but we have some of the glass jars that A.A. Lowe would package his maple syrup products in. And so it's a little tricky to see, of course, over Zoom, but these are all embossed with, it says Adirondack Mountains, Virgin Forest. It has his trademark on the jar, so you can see the horseshoe with, it looks like a little like bucket over a fire, maybe like a little boiling setup there. And then it says Horseshoe Forestry, Horseshoe, St. Lawrence County, New York. So there's this jar that has the screw top lid. We also have this tiny little jar, which, I mean, in my house, this is about one pancake's worth of maple syrup. So I'm curious if you know, would this have had maple syrup in it, or would this be sugar?
Right. So good question. So the bigger one would have had maple sugar, or another thing that were called maple kisses. So he made these little candies, which we're going to learn about a little bit more about in a second. And he would put those in those jars and wrap them up with bows and sell them for. He was right on the mark with value-added products, as they talk about today, where he would make a pretty good-looking product to sell to folks based on packaging. So that would have had like sugar in it and candies in it. The smaller jar, and then you see it, and the bigger one had that flat screw top on it.
Mm-hmm.
The smaller jar would have probably had syrup in it, and he developed these really funky metal two-piece caps on it. So it's screwed on, but it actually formed a little funnel so it tapered up to a pour spout, and then it had a cap that screwed on. So as small as that would be, it was a syrup jar.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had a variation that he patented. Again, he got the design patents on his special pour spouts and things that went with those jars. And there's a few that people have in collections. So these are really popular with collectors. And I'll admit I have a few. They're really neat, and they have, like that one. If you turn it, there's also a little tree on the side.
Yeah.
So it has some other designs all the way. It has three sides, I believe, are embossed.
Mm-hmm.
So that one also says Maple Valley, Wake Robin, Grass River, which is the name of the three sugar bushes and railroads for his maple sugaring. So it's got all this great information right there on this great little jar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, living in Tupper Lake, I live in Tupper Lake, and you hear people talk about going to Horseshoe Lake and finding these bottles. So you mentioned in your book that, of course, according to the DEC, you are not allowed to do that.
Yeah,
But, it
so
seems that people have
it's an
done that.
interesting thing. Yeah, so well, one thing I'll mention, there's about a dozen different shapes and sizes of these um, bottles and jars, and which up to some very large ones. And the small one you saw is about the smallest size it gets. But um, there once upon a time when the operations ended, for whatever reason or by whatever means, they dumped lots of these jars that were unused into Horseshoe Lake, and people know about it and they go down into the water to get them. And some are broke. There's lots of broken ones, but there's lots that are not. Technically, that is against the law. That is DEC property, and these are considered protected artifacts. So we don't encourage anyone to do that. But people have been doing it for 40 years at least. I know divers that have been doing it a long time, and it's it's an interesting history, because I mean, there's just amazing things that people have talked about, like literally crates of them. I mean, they're not anymore, but they would, when they first were examining these, the wood crates were still in place with all these jars all right there. But yeah.
And the fact that these are square, is was there a logic to that? Does that make it easier to pack them for shipping? Do you know
That's
anything?
the logic. Yeah, I mean, they were packed in boxes nicely, and it made for easier packing. There wasn't a lot of small jars for novelty little stuff like that time, so it also was attractive for sales purposes and things.
Mhm.
But some of it was probably for easy packing as well. We never have found who the glass makers. We've been trying to find who made these for them. It was probably a New York, Brooklyn manufacturer, or maybe New Jersey, but there's no maker's marks, and we've never been able to find who was the glass manufacturer. So someday the glass collecting world is very knowledgeable, and maybe someday someone will pop up with a good answer for us.
Another one of the questions I just happened to notice asked about how the Horseshoe products measured up compared to Vermont products, and this next artifact might speak to that a little bit. This is one of several diplomas and awards that we have in the collection. This one was issued by the Franklin County Agricultural and Mechanical Society, and that's Franklin County, Vermont. So A.A. Lowe submitted his syrup to multiple agricultural fairs, and judging by our holdings, he was awarded at many of these. We have maybe 5 or 6 diplomas, and I noticed on the advertisement that you showed earlier, this was a big part of his marketing, that he would say, I have won awards from all of these various maple syrup competitions. So it seems that I don't know if there was, maybe you could speak to this, if there was a difference or preference between Vermont and New York, but it seems like he could hold up his own.
Yeah, I mean, it's as a maple researcher, I always get the question, who makes the best maple syrup? And it's like asking, which child do you love the most? Or and the simple answer is there's great syrup everywhere. And so I wouldn't say it's really who is the best sugar maker, not where does the best syrup come from. And I can tell you, he poached people from Vermont. So he hired maple producers, maple experts to come with and then bring crews for the people who ran each individual sugar house. It wasn't the specialized technology or knowledge to gather sap, but the people working in the syrup plants making the final product for him. He hired people who knew what they were doing, because he hadn't really come from this maple background. He had an idea, but he was a smart enough guy to bring in the people who could make it happen. And obviously, right out of the gate, he was winning awards, and he did something right, that's for sure.
Yeah. So another thing that I brought out, and you touched on this earlier, was the the sap pail lid. And I have to admit, when we first started talking about this program and you were suggesting artifacts that I should pull out, and you said, like, make sure you get one of the lids, I thought, what could possibly be interesting about a lid? But then I pulled it out and looked at it and I read, what you had written about it. And it is interesting just how much information is kind of contained in this one object. So as I think you touched on, like this one has the two pieces of metal with the little air pocket on the inside, which was apparently to insulate the sap to keep it at an even temperature. And then one side is red, the other side is yellow, of course, so that you could signal, which buckets had been emptied. And this one, I think this might even be the same one that maybe you took the image from your book from this specific lid.
Mhm.
It has some of the same markings here. But
Yeah.
you see his own patent and logo. And then I thought it was worth mentioning that G.H. Grimm was the actual manufacturer. And it seems that he had a close relationship with that manufacturer because he was buying a lot of their product, but then also, coming up with patents that then they would manufacture and sell, like in sort of trading on the horseshoe name as part of the branding of it, which I thought was interesting.
Exactly.
And this one too, it has that the raised portion is off center,
Hmm.
which I don't know if you mentioned this in your talk, but I saw it in your book. But I was wondering if you could explain
Yeah.
what
So
the significance of that is.
there is a significance. It's so the part where it was narrower towards opposite where there was a hole at the bottom part, that would go towards the tree. And so the rim, that flaring rim, wouldn't bump up against the tree part, and so it kind of when they're up against the tree, and it would, what was really neat about this one is that it fits if you have the right can, which it was made for, the Grimm can, it fits very, very snugly in there. So there is no chance of debris or rain or anything getting in it, which was a major advancement on a lot of other sap pail covers at that time. And they just kind of sit on top like a toilet seat, whereas this thing nests right down in it, and it's like it's a friction tight seal, which was pretty neat.
Yeah, and another thing that we have here, you'd mentioned all of the patents you filed. We have a pretty thick folder full of them. So these are just a couple. I'm not going to try to make anybody read these over the camera, but I just pulled these as examples. These are, I'm pretty sure these are the patents that are actually related to the design of this lid. So yeah, nice thing about the sort of breadth of the collections that we have here is that we have objects that speak to documents, that speak to photographs, and everything, kind of combines to tell this whole story, which in your book you very nicely explain it all so that we don't have to just be jumping around from artifacts. But for me, that's always really exciting when you have things that are sort of interrelated in the collection that help to explain each other.
Yeah.
So the last thing.
One thing that's really neat is, so the fact that you have those there's a without going into the great details, but there's a great bit of history to how they came to the Adirondack Experience. So the Lowe family continued to operate a camp at what's now known as Hitchens Park or Hitchens Pond, well into the 60s, before they finally sold it. And they kept a lot of this stuff. And then when they did finally close that all up, it was donated by the superintendent caretaker, Armand Valancourt from Tupper Lake. And thankfully, a lot of that stuff, a lot of things did get lost, but a lot of things got saved and brought in there. So it's not just cool for research purposes, but I mean, just the fact that they still exist. The actual patents with the seals, for example, and the album and some of these other items are preserved forever, which is just awesome.
Yeah. So the last item that I'll show is this unwieldy object. So this is a candy mold that Lo used when he made those maple kisses that you mentioned. And yeah, what's interesting about it is it's made of rubber. So, you know, as you can see, it's flexible. And I guess this works in much the same way that like silicone baking forms do now, so that you can peel it away from the candy that you're making. And it's going to be difficult to see here, but inside each of these little squares, there's 132 squares altogether on this, and each one has a little embossed section that's with the HSF Co. Branding and the tiny little horseshoe, so that when you got your maple kiss, you had no questions about where it came from.
Right. So let me show you what those pretty much looked like. So this is a close-up photo that was taken and reversed of the mold, which showed you what the little tiny candies kind of would have looked like in the embossed HSF company with the horseshoe on it that Ivy described. And these are, you know, like an inch and a half by an inch wide, and super little thin things, almost like little thin chocolate mints. And they were individually wrapped in paper and then put in these jars with a nice bow, and sold for quite a substantial sum considering the time, like something like, you know, 10 cents a candy kind of thing or something. Pretty amazing little setup he had there. But and those molds, the rubber molds like that were very rare. That was way ahead of the game on that kind of thing. He didn't invent them. They were invented maybe 10 years before, but they were not in common use. And again, he had the means and he had the connections, and so he got on board with some pretty early ways of molding candies and other things as well, which is just really interesting too. And it's so cool that you guys have a couple of those molds still, which that kind of rubber, I mean, those are real rubber, those are not silicone, and that stuff doesn't hold up as well over time and things. It's pretty neat.
Yeah, I know. I will say for everybody at home, be glad you're not in the same room as this mold, because it has an odd smell. I wouldn't want to be eating candy made from this anymore. But so yeah, I think we have some time.
Some more questions.
I'll pull up the questions here. So this is kind of a basic one, but maybe a good foundational one. How much sap do you need to boil down to make what's the ratio of?
Yeah, so making maple syrup takes 40 gallons of sap on average to make 1 gallon of syrup. And in his day, the technology was a little more primitive and less efficient. So today they can make a lot more syrup from a tap, and then move into the whole world of plastic tubing and things and vacuums and reverse osmosis. Today's modern technology is super efficient and super high tech, but he would, 40 gallons, just think about 50,000 taps. And it's hard to say how much we don't have statistics on exactly how much he made in each year. One thing that's really disappointing, just as a researcher, is there was an office in the Horseshoe settlement that burned, and it's where were lots of records. And so 1909, there was a big fire there's a fire that burned that building up, and records that I would just be dying to see these days are gone. And I'm sure that, he was the kind of guy that kept a lot of records. He was a very formal guy about everything. And so we know that the records existed for sure, but some of that stuff has been lost. So we don't have production numbers. We just know the size of his operation and things. But
another question here was, in your research, were you able to talk to any locals who had family memories that were passed down, maybe about the Horseshoe operation?
The short answer is never found anybody who we talked to that had family that had been there, because it would have been 4 generations essentially ago. There were people that knew for example, they knew the Lowe family and they knew of them when they still were living on the land, but the maple operation stopped in 1908, which is quite a long time ago. And so there was nobody that we ever encountered who could tell us about memories that were passed down specifically about the maple sugaring operation. There were always lots of stories that people had about things that they acquired and embellished from various different ways, which was part of the fun of hearing about things. But yeah, never connected. So if there is somebody out there that has a familial connection, I love to talk to you, because that's something we were never able to arrange or discover.
Yeah, it reminds me of you had mentioned the Armand Vaillancourt. When he donated a bunch of this material, he included a letter that sort of described, what he knew about the horseshoe operation. And so this was in 1969 that he wrote the letter. And a funny thing about that letter is it starts off with him saying, "I've only worked for the Lowe family for 42 years, so I can't tell you anything about this maple operation," but
Right.
I just love the way he's like, "I've only worked for them for 42
Right.
years."
And that's one of our best pieces of evidence, because he was so close. I mean, even though he didn't work for them while the maple operation and all these things were happening, he was there, within, and he worked for the family for the next generation who was there. So he heard things, firsthand. He just wasn't. He was one step away, which is, that's the challenges of this kind of research, is finding those people. Unfortunately, he wrote that great letter and wrote a lot of stuff down, which is it's a gem. Yeah.
Let's see, because we're running short on time, but maybe one more question. It's a multi-parter, but asking where the workers were hired from, and also how you became interested in maple syrup history and horseshoe forestry.
So I love that. That's a good question on the workers. So I don't have this specific statistics right in front of me. They're in the book, but from looking at the census information, we could see what were the ethnicities and things. So and the Tupper Lake area is known for having a significant French Canadian population at that time that were coming in to work in the woods and stuff. And so there was probably, I forget the exact numbers, it was about half non-native born people, sometimes from Canada, sometimes from Germany, a few other Scandinavian places. And then the other half were US born, and of the US born, the overwhelming majority were from New York. But it was a real mixture of people, and it was mostly single men, but there were some families as well. And so he had family housing for them. And then, but you also had some really big boarding houses that a lot of, really, I mean, they weren't like logging camp primitive. They were a little bit more sophisticated, but he took care of his people for sure. But it was a bustling little place. So my background, or how did I get into this? Boy, that's a long story, but I'm not from a maple sugaring background. I'm an archaeologist and a historian, and I discovered this topic about 20 some years ago when I worked in northern Wisconsin, and I got bit. I got maple fever, as they say, and discovered there was a room for a lot of work to be done. So I kind of set my mind to researching maple history stories. This one's been really fun because there's the whole on the ground aspect of getting out and trying to find these places, not just squirreling myself away in the archives or looking at computer records and things, and talking to people. I love the part of talking to people as much as any of it, but also getting out. I love being in the woods and getting out there looking for what's left and trying to put that whole big picture together from the archival and historical documents and what people can tell us, and then what we can see on the ground. But there's a lot more to learn about maple history and also horseshoe history. So
we're about to run out of time, but maybe if you could put that slide up that has your contact information, because there's more questions than we can get to. So I think people can reach out to you or I with any questions they still have. And of course, to buy your book, because that tells us in much more depth than we can cover in an hour-long presentation.
Yeah, if you're interested in more questions or getting in touch with us, you can see our emails up there. There's a website, sugarbushlikeNoneOther.com, which is specifically about this book. And there's links in there to purchase the book on eBay. But if you're in the Tupper Lake area in particular, I encourage you to go to the public library, where it is also for sale. There's a few other locations, Saranac Lake, the Book Nook, Long Lake, Haas's Country Store. So there's a few places, but also you can order online if that's not convenient. And I also have another website called mapleSyrupHistory.com if you want to learn more about some of my other research. Yeah, please reach out if you want to know more or have questions or got leads for us. We appreciate it. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Bronstein. I am the Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience, and I really would like to just thank all of you for joining us this evening with this new series in collaboration with Meg and the Albany Public Library. And especially thank you to Matt and Ivy. And again, just wanted to invite all of you to join us next week for Food, Glorious Food, and on April 14th for our program, our Encore program, with Chef Kevin McCarthy and some of the students at the Culinary Arts program at Paul Smith College. And then we've got our 2 Try It at Home programs coming up on butter making and balsam traditions. You can find all the information for those programs at both the Albany Public Library website as well as with the Adirondack Experience website. We are sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions today. We have tried to record the questions and Matt or Ivy will be able, hopefully, to get back to you. And the recording of this program should be available on everybody's websites in just a few days. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Matt.
Bye-bye.